Hello and welcome to Car Dealer Live. I'm James Batchelor and thank you very much for joining us. Now, today I'm speaking with Stuart Folds, the Chairman and Chief Executive of Trust Ford, a business that has just won Used Car Dealership Group of the Year in the Car Dealer Used Car Awards 2020. And Stuart joins me now. Hello, Stuart.
Hi, James. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, we last spoke, well, you last spoke with my colleague James Baggett in October in a socially distanced studio where you and I are now even more socially distanced because we're doing this on a computer screen. But that was back in October we last spoke to you. So just give us an idea of how you ended the year because, what with another lockdown in November, I'm sure the situation changed between October and the end of the year for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, we obviously went through the big lockdown from March through to July. Business was okay during that period. We managed to obviously keep our workshops open. Sales departments had to close, but we did a lot of click and collect and home delivery. And then we came out into July and business was really, really busy. Again, a lot to pent up demand and finance agreements which had expired that had to be renewed. And we thought everything was going swimmingly. And then, of course, we got this bang and told to lock up again in November, which came as a bit of a shock. But, we had learned a lot of lessons through the first lockdown. So that taught us well to actually cope with the November lockdown. And then, of course, we then came into December. Everything was again starting to go really well. And bang, we got another lockdown, which is where we are today. So it's been up and down all over the place. But the good news is, from Trust Ford's point of view, we learned a lot of lessons. We're well placed to cope with the lockdown that we've got just now. And I think, somebody put it into some context that in March last year, I think that the number of sales that we did, you can sort of anecdotally sort of count on one hand. And the amount of sales we did in January were into the thousands. So learned loads of lessons. And January for us turned out to be actually an okay month. I mean, the industry was down 40%. We were probably reflective of that. But the good news from our point of view is that cars, in terms of used cars, was very strong. Our Trust Ford Now proposition has come into its own, where we can move cars from one dealership to another and then have the car delivered to customers' homes. That's worked extremely well for us. And then, of course, our service departments have never been busier. And the same applies to our body shops being busy. Again, not maybe as busy as it would be, but that's probably down to the fact that there's not so many cars on the road over the past month or two. Commercial vehicles has been a huge success for us, James. I mean, throughout last year and this year so far, it's been absolutely on fire. And that's a lot to do with delivery companies taking up supply. So from that perspective, I guess, our commercial vehicles have probably balanced the books as far as the decline in the cars side has probably been replaced by commercial vehicles. So great. What else have we had to, again, like everybody, we've had to furlough some people, which has been, there's been a bit of a saving grace there in terms of not having to make people redundant. So that's been positive. But, in general, business is actually pretty good just now. And, touching wood, I think it's okay, and we're sort of well sort of served in terms of how we cope with it. We're looking forward to this lockdown being lifted. Obviously, March is a big month for the industry. At this point in time, we're kind of hoping that March will still happen, but there's no guarantee that that is going to happen. But I think if it doesn't, then I suspect that April will become March, because if you look at the industry, there's a lot of customers whose finance agreements expire in March. They have to change the car or do something. Yeah. And the finance companies have been pretty good in terms of giving them a little bit of flex. So if we miss March, in the true sense of the word, I think it'll actually happen in April. So I'm pretty optimistic.
Yeah. I mean, normally at this time of year, we'd be talking about the March order bank. I mean, is that a thing at the moment, or is it just, you're just taking each week as it comes?
No, there is a March order bank, and it's building quite nicely. I mean, it's not at the levels that we would have had probably pre pandemic, but it's still pretty healthy. And, you know, given the nature of the cyclical business that we're in, where, you know, a very high percentage of customers are on some form of finance agreement, then it follows that these cars have to be replaced in that cycle, which means kind of March, April. So order bank's pretty good.
Good, good. Now, I mean, a lot of this, of course, hinges on showrooms actually being allowed to reopen again. There's lots of question marks about that happening. You know, you're in charge of such a huge dealer network in the UK. I mean, have you been really frustrated about how the government has been handling this? I mean, you know, there's much talk about, you know, garden centres being allowed to open, yet dealerships have had to close. I mean, do you think the government have got it right? And do you think, for instance, the SMT, for example, haven't been sort of rallying hard enough to get showrooms open?
It's a difficult call, James. I mean, on the one hand, I believe that showrooms should be open, but I can equally sympathise to an extent that if we were allowed to open, other businesses would be saying, well, why is it okay for them to open and not for us? So I guess there's that sort of difficult position. In terms of, if you actually look across the UK, there have been significant differences between the different nations. So, for example, in the last lockdown in November, in Scotland, dealerships were allowed to have their forecourts open, and they were able to do test drives from the forecourts. So what in effect happened was that dealers with showrooms basically moved their vehicles out onto the forecourt and were able to transact pretty much as normal. In England, of course, they closed showrooms and forecourts down full stop. And then in Northern Ireland, where we're a big representation in Northern Ireland, they've actually shut full stop. They're not even allowing click and collect, which I think is just a piece of nonsense, to be honest. So, you can't do home delivery, you can't do click and collect. So in effect, the Northern Ireland businesses from a sales perspective have more or less ground to a standstill. And of course, the frustration in Northern Ireland is that they don't have plate changes as we have in mainland UK. So January is actually the biggest month of the year. And that's effectively just been blown completely out of the water because we can't transact. So in answer to your question, I think the government haven't got it right. I think that there's an awful lot of bureaucracy out there. I don't think the MPs really understand what this is all about. They don't understand what our business is all about. We're very COVID friendly in terms of distancing, all the PPE that we've invested in. I mean, we've spent probably, I would think nowadays, probably up to £500,000 of PPE just to keep the businesses safe for customers and, importantly, for our colleagues as well. So we've taken all the measures. It's just unfortunate that they've taken that stance to actually close us from a sales perspective, operating from showrooms. Yeah. But as I said earlier on, our Trustful Now proposition allows us to do click and collect in a much more customer-friendly way than perhaps ever was before.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, how do you plan for business in Northern Ireland in 2021? Or have you effectively got to write off 2021 and just look forward to 2022?
Well, no, I think we'll be back to some normality in the next month or two. But as I say, the frustration has been that January being the biggest month has kind of been completely scuppered. So it'll come back. And I guess the sort of million-dollar question is, will we be able to cram a 12 months worth of business into, let's say, 9, open back in March or April? That's the big question. Again, just the same as mainland UK, an awful lot of these customers are on finance agreements, so they do need to do something. The Motability fleet in Northern Ireland is big as well, so there's a lot of Motability customers who are basically waiting for the replacement vehicle to turn up. So being handled differently in different parts of the country. There's no sort of cohesive approach. It's been sort of different approaches and a bit shambolic, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think we've got to have a sense of sort of optimism because, I mean, 2020, I mean, how dealers rallied to actually make a success of it. So perhaps we should have a bit of optimism that it's going to be all right. And like you say, there's always going to be a bit of pent-up demand and people are coming out of finance agreements as well. So whilst it is challenging, there definitely is a market there. And I probably think buyer confidence is pretty high when it comes to cars, not quite so in the rest of the society, but when it comes to cars, people still want a new car, don't they?
The big thing for the motor industry in 2020 and today is liquidity. That's the big sort of black cloud that's hanging over a lot of businesses out there. I mean, we're in a very strong position from a financial aspect. Our liquidity is extremely good, so we've not got an issue in that respect. But there are some businesses out there that will definitely be struggling just to make ends meet, because a 40% decline in the new car market and the used car market, that can be pretty painful. And if you've got bills to pay and mortgages to pay and all of that, then cash is king, absolutely king. And that I think is going to be an issue for some groups as we go forward, because it's like, if you go to your bank in a position today and say, I could do to borrow some extra money, please, I suspect the answer might be no thanks, we're not really interested, but we're in a great position, so that's not an issue from Trustford's point of view.
Yeah. One sort of big announcement last year was, of course, Ford saying it was going to start to consolidate its business and its UK dealer network. I mean, has that started to take shape at Trustford? I mean, have you had to close many showrooms permanently, for instance?
Out of choice, we've consolidated some of the smaller businesses into the sort of motherships. And if you think back over the years, the Ford sort of franchise was to have a mothership and then some satellites on what they call a CMA, customer market area. So you would have the principal dealership in the big town, and then you would have the smaller dealerships in surrounding towns or provinces. That model has sort of kind of gone full circle, and they're now basically saying we don't want to do that any longer. We want to look at number of units, throughput per site. And if you look at the Ford model compared to our German other equivalents, Ford have much more in the way of dealerships than, say, Volkswagen or Audi. So the throughput per dealership is much lower, or has been much lower than some of our German counterparts. And so from our point of view, we've taken an opportunity to consolidate that, and we have closed and sold some of the smaller sites, which for me is actually to a benefit to us, because we can push more revenue through one site than perhaps spreading it thin over 3 or 4. So in answer to your question, yeah, it started. There's still a long journey to go for the dealer network. It's nowhere near. I mean, I think the plan was to reduce it down to just over 200 dealerships from 380, something like that. So it's nowhere near down that journey, but we've certainly started from our point of view. So we're sort of, again, quite well placed as to where our facilities are. And in 2020, despite the pandemic, we still did quite a lot of redevelopment, and we've still got redevelopment plans on the go today for redeveloping some of our sites and doing that continued consolidation. So we've got lots on just now.
Yeah.
We've just, in the past 24 hours, received planning permission for a relocation and consolidation in Guernsey over in the Channel Islands. And that's good news from our point of view, because we've currently got 2 sites there. We've got a big body shop on a big site, and then we've got in St. Peterport, we've got a showroom and a workshop which we rent, and the landlord has got permission to move that into housing. But for us, that's actually worked out very well, because it allows us to move the sales and service departments across to the body shop site, give us all one consolidated site, save us some money. But good news from our point of view is it also gives us a good solid foundation for our colleagues across there that we're continuing to invest.
Yeah.
So that's positive news for us.
Yeah, definitely. Has the situation on the Channel Islands been very different from mainland, or not? Is it just it's not a microcosm of what's going on, is it?
No, it's quite unusual over there, because what you've got effectively are 2 independent states. So you've got the state of Jersey and the state of Guernsey, and they're 2 completely independent. So they have their own sort of parliaments and do their own things. So both islands have had a similar furlough scheme, not the same, but similar furlough scheme. But Guernsey came out of lockdown quite early on, but just a few weeks ago, they've actually locked the whole thing down. So Guernsey is actually a complete lockdown just now because they've had some outbreaks of cases there. So Jersey's okay. Jersey's still sort of kind of open for business. Guernsey's pretty much locked down just now. And of course, for us, we're a big rental operator over there. So that's been quite hard from our point of view because we're the Hertz franchisee in both islands, operating from both airports. And of course, there's been no tourism at all. So there's been no car rental business at all.
Oh, that sounds pretty challenging. It's something we don't really hear too much about on the mainland. So that's really interesting to know. One thing I'd just like to talk to you about is when we last spoke to you, we were talking about smart hubs, and that's a really interesting venture. I mean, how has that been, or has it been sort of curtailed a little bit by lockdowns? So how's it been going?
Well, I mean, you could hardly have written this down. I mean, we had the plan to do the smart hub. We had visited the sites over in Italy to understand how it all works. We got our first site secured just outside Castleford. We were ready to open back in sort of late August, beginning of September. We then got wind of this November lockdown, so that kind of put that all on hold. So we opened our smart hub literally the 1st of December and closed it on the 31st of December because the shopping mall that we're in was effectively closed. So we only had a month of experience of how it was actually running. But for me, the good thing is that even in that short space of time, it proved to be extremely popular with customers who were really interested to see. It allows us to showcase vehicles in an environment where it's not like walking into a showroom where you're going to get pounced upon by sales executives. Cars very much on display, showcased, lots of interest. So that short space of time, very promising. So we're sort of desperate to get it open again once this next current lockdown is lifted.
Yeah, it really is an interesting model. I mean, I was talking to the MD of Polestar a few weeks ago, and of course they've got that facility in Westfield in London and at the Trafford Centre in Manchester as well. And we've seen these kinds of things before, but it is an interesting model, isn't it? It's this kind of approach where you're not actively selling to a customer, but you're just informing them. I mean, do you think the motor trade and your dealer group as well can learn a few tricks from that, or have the two things got to be mutually exclusive?
I think they are mutually exclusive, James, but one thing that the experience that we had, and one of the lessons certainly from our counterpart over in Italy, was opening these show areas in a very expensive shopping malls. It doesn't work. It's too expensive. We were involved with the Ford experiment over in Manchester, and we exited that middle of last year because the cost was just prohibitive. So going to somewhere like Westfield for like the Polestar and places like Bluewater and all that, it's probably a little bit less expensive than it might have been pre a lot of the high street stores going bust, but it's still a very expensive venue to operate from. The one we've got in Castleford is low cost, and that to me is the secret, is having a low cost, high volume shopping mall. And again, importantly for us, our display is in it's the hub of the mall. So it's not like a showroom where you actually have to cross a threshold. You're actually in the body of the centre. And I think that is the lesson that the guys in Italy learned, is that is the success, is to have it in that open environment rather than, as I say, having to cross a threshold and actually walk in. It's a little bit like Tesla. Some of the Tesla stores are shops, and I've seen them in America where they've been very successful, but they've been in a sort of mall type environment. Whereas some of the ones in the UK are, again, you've got to make it a destination. You've got to actually go through that door, which you get captured the minute you do that.
Yeah. So if the sums add up and we sort of get back to some kind of normality this year, will you be looking at widening that plan? Yeah.
Because I think what it taught us, where the new one is, at Junction 32, it's in a shopping mall next to a ski slope, next to a big cinema complex, but it's only about half a mile from our main Castleford Ford store. So what that allowed us to do is that the customers who have expressed any form of interest in the mall, we can either direct them across to the Ford store or service them from that perspective. And again, one of the key benefits that we have is that we have a fleet of demonstrators outside the mall, so that if somebody does express an interest, we can say, you know, we can take it for demonstration. So the answer to the question is, yeah, if it looks as if it's going to be successful, and if it continues to do so, then my intention would be to open more of these across the UK.
Yeah. Good to hear. Now, let's just talk about the market in more widely, particularly with Ford. I mean, you know, a lot of manufacturers lost a lot of market share last year, understandably, but it did seem as though some rivals were catching up Ford and overtaking them. Is there a bit of pressure this year from Ford to actually sort of turn around, you know, a few of the losses from 2020?
Well, I think, you know, at the end of the day, Ford have been market leaders for so many years in both commercial vehicles. But I think that from their perspective, and I've got no inside track on this, so I'm not telling you something that's secret because I don't have the answer. But I don't think that market dominance is necessarily the number one thing for them. I think that they need to be profitable. That is key. That they have to be profitable, and if that means that there's a little bit less volume but more profitable volume, then I'm sure that's the road that they'll go down. And certainly from our point of view, if you look at the range now that Ford have, you know, Puma, the new Puma is very much the vehicle that's the future for Ford, and you'll see lots of derivatives coming from that. And then of course we've got Mustang Mach-E, which is going to be this real halo effect that comes, and then there'll be much more in the way of electrification for both cars and commercial vehicles as we move forward. You know, I think Ford, from a global point of view, were probably a few years ago maybe slightly behind our competitors as far as electrification is concerned, but they've accelerated that dramatically over the past 12 months, and you'll see much more in the way of electrification heading in our direction. And for me, the big exciting one is commercial vehicle electrification for commercial vehicles, because you know, if you go into some of the big cities, a lot of them are talking about tariffs, congestion charge, and the ability for a van to do its inside London driving, if you like, on electric power rather than on diesel. Then I think that comes with huge benefits. And certainly Ford are well down the road as far as that's concerned. Another interesting fact, which again, it was something that I picked up to do with the market, and this applies not just to Ford, it applies to most big manufacturers. If you think about the global pandemic and the global cessation of flights at airports, you effectively wipe out the car rental business. So if you think about all the big airports all over the world that have got tens upon tens of thousands of vehicles historically for rent, that business is gone. So that's why there's been a decline in a lot of markets on actual volume itself, because there is no car rental market. Yeah. Well, there's van rental because demand for vans is high. But in terms of, you know, you fly to wherever, Germany, pick up a hire car, go and do your business, or go to a foreign country for a holiday, get a hire car, that business is gone. Totally gone.
Yeah. No, I didn't know that, but it makes perfect sense when you say it like that. Yeah. And you're sort of experiencing that a little bit in the Channel Islands, like you were saying. I mean, without tourists coming in, they're not going to be hiring cars, are they?
Exactly. Well, we're just a tiny proportion.
Yeah.
But, you know, as I said, I never really thought about it. And it was somebody said, you know, the rental market has just collapsed. There isn't one.
Yeah. I know we briefly touched upon it earlier on, but commercial vehicles. What with the huge seismic change in people's buying behaviours, partly because they've had to change the way they buy things, but also because that's the way things were going anyway.
Yeah.
These changes are here to stay forever, really, aren't they? People getting stuff delivered to their homes, which will fuel the demand in vans. Are you struggling to get hold of vans? I mean, are there any problems getting hold of new stock?
It's not as freely available as it was. We've got plenty of stock. We've got plenty of stock in pipeline and getting manufactured. So we're not short, but we've certainly not got the excess that traditionally we've always carried quite a lot of unsold stock. We're not in that position today. I think some of the other manufacturers have got a real issue with stock. I'm led to believe Volkswagen, for example, is a real tough time in terms of getting stock. One of the other issues that affects, again, the industry is this problem with semiconductors, which I think is something that's been completely missed by the industry. I don't think people appreciate just how big a problem that is. If you actually go and Google semiconductor shortage, you'll be shocked at what's on some of these news lines. I mean, Ford had to close their Focus production line in Saarlouis in Germany. Volkswagen have had to close some of their production lines. All the manufacturers are going through the same problem. And that's been one of the issues, I believe, why there's some shortage on some of the VW supply. I think is related more to do with semiconductors than actual demand being greater than supply.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've been watching that story develop as well, and it's amazingly, you know, there are some odd quirks like companies like Jaguar Land Rover, because they're seen as slightly more niche and a bit more specialist. They've been able to get enough supply of semiconductors, whereas the big brands like Ford and Volkswagen, for example, because they're in the volume market, they've been struggling, and it does seem to be a huge problem with the car industry at the moment. They're trying to make great leaps forward with electrification and trying to move towards these goals that are coming in the next 10 years, and yet they're being held back by little things like semiconductors. It's incredible.
Well, as I say, I think that it just hasn't been given the publicity that it probably deserves. And I think the other thing as well is that semiconductors don't just apply to cars. I mean, Apple phones have got semiconductors. This is a global problem. And, you know, on a sort of a more comical note, the story flying about was that this was China getting their own back on Donald Trump.
Well, we won't go down that avenue, not for today at least. Now, just give us a bit of sense of optimism, Stuart. I mean, you know, we're all about that here at Car Dealer. 2021, I mean, what big plans have you got, and what's your sort of mentality moving forwards?
Well, I'm really optimistic. I think, as I said, we've learned a lot of lessons through the previous pandemic. We're well able to cope with it today. We've sort of trimmed the business. We're much more lean than perhaps we were. We're financially very fit. I'm very optimistic in terms of what we've got as plans going forward. Our colleagues have been fantastic. The finance community within the business has been fantastic as well, and making sure debt recoveries have been well handled. It's all to go for, James. I think, you know, I've certainly not written 2021 off. I think that it'll be okay. We finished 2020 positively. We made you know, if somebody had said to me, what was it going to look like in July? It had been a completely different picture to how we ended up. We ended up very profitable for 2020, which, you know, I didn't think that would be the case because of basically being shut down for so many months. But we did. We came out strongly. And I'm optimistic this year will be okay.
Brilliant. Well, I share your optimism as well, and hopefully we can you know, catch up a little bit, few months' time, and see how the situation's progressed. But for today, Stuart, thank you so much for joining us. Really do appreciate it. Okay, James. Thank you. Cheers. So that's it for today's Car Dealer Live. If you'd like to be involved in the show, then please do email me, james.batchelor@blackbullmedia.co.uk. But for today, thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.